So just 3 days after President Joe Biden read Prime Minister Netanyahu the Riot Act in a phone call on Thursday evening, Israel time, Israel removed its main maneuver division out of Gaza, which was operating in southern Gaza in the town of Khan Yunis for several months. And the signal that it sent to the Israeli public and to the wider world is that for whatever reason, Israel has decided to curtail in a significant way its ground operations in Gaza. The Israeli media was quick to announce that the war in Gaza had ended. And the assessment that Israel was buckling under U.S. pressure for an immediate ceasefire, even before any sort of hostages for ceasefire and terrorists sitting in Israeli jails has been concluded with Hamas. And there's a real sense in Israel itself of just defeatism and depression that we came so far and we're walking away without victory. And this morning, I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., I read an article that my friend and colleague from the Foundation of Defense for Democracies, Richard Goldberg, who's been on this show in the past, had written about how Israel's withdrawal of Division 98 from Gaza is perceived by the wider world. And I thought it was important to have Richard back on the show this week to talk about what's happening on the ground, how it's perceived in the region, and what it means going forward in terms of Israel-U.S. relations, and really more importantly, in terms of Israel's strategic position vis-a-vis Iran and all of its terror proxies that surround Israel today. So without further ado, I want to welcome you, Richard, back to the Carolyn Glick Show. Thanks very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So in your article, was it published yesterday in the New York Post? It's called, Did Israel Surrender to White House Pressure in Gaza? Iran likely thinks so. Can you just walk me through the basic arguments that you make in the article, and then we can just take it from there?
Yeah, obviously there's two sides to this right now, and only a handful of people know the ground truth, within the security cabinet of Israel and likely the White House. But on its face, the optics are not good, given the timing of, as you put it, the president reading the prime minister, the Riot Act, what we saw John Kirby, the White House spokesperson, deployed to the Sunday shows here in the United States, following his tour de force on various networks and from the White House podium after the president's call with the prime minister, in which they were, in not so many words, threatening a potential shift in U.S. support for Israel overall, whether that would be a cutoff of military assistance, no longer having Israel's back in international fora, though, of course, the recent UN Security Council debacle of allowing a pro-Hamas resolution to go forward questions the value of that already. But in general, really, especially in the military resupply realm, if the United States was going to be threatening Israel in some way with the military support alliance, at a moment when Iran was also threatening a major retaliation for an Israeli strike on IRGC senior officials in Damascus last week, that could be a major vulnerability for Israel. And within moments, we had already seen Israel declare reversal in many policies as far as areas crossing, how much humanitarian goods are going to go into northern Gaza, how they're going to go in, the use of the Ashdod port for resupply into Gaza, all these things that had been off the table until now, suddenly back on the table after the phone call with the president. And then you have just 72 hours later, this announcement of Division 98 withdrawing from southern Gaza, leaving very few relative to the initial invasion force posture in place. Though you do have, of course, the Nachal Brigade still in place along the central corridor, the Netzarim corridor of Gaza. That's the east-west highway that separates north and south. The Israelis making the argument this was always in the plan. They'll be able to do special operations raid north and south, stop the flow of fighters from the south to the north or vice versa. But the optics, and as you just say, how the headlines read it, operations are over, forces are withdrawn. There is no total victory, as the prime minister had talked about achieving at some point. There is no hostage deal on the table that comes alongside this at this point. There is only leaks from the media that the president told the prime minister to get a deal no matter what at the table in Cairo, whatever it took for the Israeli conditions to change. And if you're sitting in Tehran, if you're sitting in Beirut, Hassan Nasrallah, with the daily attacks on Israel's north, or if you're sitting in the tunnels underneath Rafah, where we were told there was supposed to be a coming operation for weeks, even with this withdrawal, the Israelis claiming they're preparing still at some point for a Rafah operation that may or may not come. If you're Yahya Sinwar, if you're Hassan Nasrallah, if you're the Ayatollah in Tehran, how do you read this? How do you read this? I mean, it's very difficult for me to believe that they would perceive anything other than Israeli weakness, Israeli buckling, America pulling the carpet out from underneath its ally, and its ally being so dependent on that champion that it buckles under demands and cuts short its war objectives in Gaza. What does that mean for Lebanon? If the Americans can cut the Israelis off at the knee in Gaza with 4 battalions left in Rafah, and, nearing victory, as we were told by the defense minister and prime minister for weeks now, they're going to be able to cut them off at the knee in any sort of escalation in southern Lebanon, which is a much larger conflict, a much larger threat and force than Hamas has ever been. When you look at Hezbollah's force structure in southern Lebanon, its capabilities, the hundreds of thousands of rockets and missiles and drones that it has in southern Lebanon. And then you think of the even larger threat, the existential threat in Iran that has been racing forward in its nuclear weapons development under cover of all of these wars that it has started, the fires that it has set from Tehran around the Middle East. Its potential for escalation, not just through its proxies, but in its own right. And its belief that the United States is so timid, so election weary and anxious, so interested in appeasement rather than confrontation, avoidance of escalation at all fronts, that it can run the board at this point, that the Israelis are ultimately weak. And so my point in the op-ed is... Yeah, just to say, that is a perception problem. It may not be reality. It may not be real. We have the defense minister saying, it's not true. We're not done with the war. These troops have been fighting hard for 4 months. This was always going to be the transition plan. We have a strategy of special operations going forward, like the Al-Shifa raid. We believe in our intelligence capabilities and apparatus that's been built through these operations. They obviously have a ton of intel that's come in from all the people captured at Al-Shifa and interrogations, that they're still committed to Rafah as they're looking at stabilizing the north, facilitating the passage of people and evacuation at some point out of Rafah, negotiations with the Egyptians to take that border that has to happen anyways. That could all be true. But that doesn't mean you don't have a perception problem right now, today, while we have a red light blinking in intelligence channels that Iran is preparing a major escalation and a major response to the strike in Damascus. That means the Israelis have to do something right now to send signals to Sinwar that they're still coming for him. Otherwise, what hope do you have for the hostages? To Nasrallah, that you are not going to allow this type of warfare to be normalized on the northern border, and that no one's going to hold Israel back from pushing Hezbollah and its capabilities away from the border, not just through some magical ceasefire.
I just want to interrupt you for a second. Before we get into what Israel has to do, and I want to go to that, I want to ask you, what do you think, is there strategic thinking going on when you look at what the White House is doing? Are they thinking here strategically, or are they in panic over the election and they just want this war to end as quickly as possible? So what is it? What is the strategic goal that they're seeking to pursue by humiliating and kneecapping their strongest ally in the Middle East in the middle of a war? How do you see if you were trying to figure out what it is, or you try to figure out what it is that's motivating the White House to act in such open hostility and really humiliating Israel? What is the message? I mean, the message that they're sending is that we've abandoned Israel as an ally. Why? And I'm sure that they understand that that's the message that's being perceived by the nations of the region, and certainly by the Israeli people. Why? What is their ultimate goal here? What is it why are they doing this? How do you understand their behavior?
They believe that their primary objective is to contain, whatever that means. And in their mind, containment means stopping the war in Gaza.
Contain Iran? Contain what?
Contain crisis, contain escalation, contain bad news, contain the feeling of anxiety and the world on fire. Get on to the economy, get on to other issues, stop having to look at protesters at every one of your events, uncommitted voters in Michigan, things of this nature. They feel distracted, they feel bogged down, and they think that all of their problems unlock themselves if Israel ends major operations in Gaza and the media moves on. That if there is a ceasefire in Gaza, they will get Hezbollah to agree to a ridiculous deal that will force the Israelis into a bad deal in Lebanon. There will be a ceasefire then on the northern border, that the Iranians will no longer have the pretext to be setting off various fires here and there. So Gaza is at ceasefire. Then they get Lebanon at ceasefire. The Houthis have lost their pretext to fire into the Red Sea, so they claim, because they say they're doing it for Gaza. So now the Red Sea returns to normalcy, and they keep paying Iran's racket on the nuclear side to avoid the nuclear escalation through the election. So all their problems in their mind go away if they just kneecap the Israelis to a point where the war is over in Gaza, at whatever point. And so, yeah, go ahead.
That really speaks to a very superficial, if even that, understanding of the nature of Iran and of its proxies and what they seek in the region. I mean, it seems like the United States under the Biden administration doesn't really view Iran as a strategic issue, as a strategic threat, but it's something that, they just get mad every once in a while, sort of like, I don't know, a drunk at a neighborhood bar goes out, picks up some stuff, and then he goes away. And if you keep him fat and happy, he'll just leave you alone. Like they don't, there seems to be a remarkable lack of regard for the seriousness of purpose of Iran and its proxies. I mean, do you see it that way, or is it an ideological affinity for the Iranians that's driving this? How do you look at it? I mean, either way, they just don't seem to take seriously any of the strategic realities on the ground in the Middle East.
There's no question that there are those in the administration that have ideological views towards Iran that are detached from what I would have considered mainstream just a few years ago. And those are people like Rob Malley, who has now departed under suspicious terms, the former special envoy for Iran, who's now on unpaid leave pending some investigation we still can't get details on. Those types are fully ideological. They're on the record. Iran's not our true enemy. We've made them our enemy. Hezbollah and Hamas are not terrorist organizations. These are political labels. That's an ideology on the far left. What the president has said to actually grade him on and assess his policy and his strategy is that basically nothing matters except the Iranian nuclear program, and that everything else that Iran does is just something to be managed. The Iranian nuclear program is a threat. It's a threat above any other, and we don't want to go to war. We don't want to worsen all the other threats that Iran poses. We're still trying to manage them, and therefore, let's try to mitigate the nuclear program as long as possible, paying them their racket to keep them under a threshold, and see if we can't manage that problem as well, and that we're willing to subsidize the other problems if it allows us to manage what he views as the top problem, the nuclear program. He has said this on the record, that is the number one threat we face, and if it means giving up on the other ones, he's willing to focus just on the nuclear piece. And of course, his strategy is not to eliminate the nuclear program or threat. It is simply to play their game of nuclear extortion, which then subsidizes all the other fires they set throughout the region and the world.
So it's interesting. So maybe we can move on to Israel, though we'll go back to the United States, I'm certain. So Israelis aren't stupid, and we're not superficial, although we'd like to be. I think many Israelis would very much like to be able to engage in the same kind of ridiculous, non-strategic discourse that appears to be dominant in the Biden administration's assessment of the region, but we can't. I mean, it's too dangerous. What happened on October 7th is a very clear demonstration of what happens when, what the destructive force we face actually is. And I think that there had been an attempt by Israel's strategic leadership to act the way the Biden administration is doing, saying Hamas is deterred, it's all fine, or Hezbollah in the past. One of Netanyahu's greatest enemies, his former defense minister Moshe Ya'alon, said famously or infamously that Hezbollah's missiles are just going to rust away in their silos, and not taking this threat seriously from any of Iran's terror proxies. And now we see that they're, unfortunately, they're genocidally serious. They're serious about genocide. And they're barbarians, and they relish the idea of annihilating the Jews and do it whenever they can in the most barbaric way they possibly can think of. And so Israel doesn't have the luxury to kick anything down the road after October 7th. And yet we're placed in this quandary because over the past 20 years or so, the same strategic leadership that failed us on October 7th has also insisted that Israel can be completely dependent on the United States, that we can trust the United States to stand with us. We moved production facilities, or we closed down our own independent military production facilities, and became very, very dependent on American supply of basic munitions, including 155 millimeter tank shells and artillery shells, etc., that you need in order to fight a war, even bullets. And assault rifles. These are all things that Israel used to produce on its own, and then it closed down production lines. So Israel is facing this, and we look horrible. We look incredibly vulnerable when we're perceived as being, and may in fact be, the Americans' whipping boy, that they can just order around, and we're allowed to fight a little bit when they let us, and then we have to stand down when they tell us to. What can Israel do under this? If the circumstances are as bad in terms of American control over Israel's capacity to wage war as they appear to be today, what sort of advice do you think? What sort of things Israel should be thinking about in order to secure its existence, given all of the constraints on its independence of action?
Yeah, I mean, I come to the starting point as an American policymaker who believes very strongly in the benefits, the mutual benefits of a U.S.-Israel security relationship. And we don't have a long enough podcast to even go through the litany of things that we have gotten from Israel out of this relationship in R&D, in tech that we incorporate into our own military platforms, not just what we have sold to Israel over the years and the financing we have provided for expensive platforms. You think about counterterrorism and intelligence sharing and all that, and how many American lives have been saved by our relationship with Israel. Put aside the parochial interests in congressional districts that have jobs in the defense supply chain that make it very, very good to continue to have a robust defense industrial base that not just produces weapons that the United States needs for the multi-fronts that we now face in the world of China and Russia, Iran and North Korea and others, but also to be able to sell to our allies like Israel. The problem that we face is twofold. Number one, we have the rise of the far left, and to some extent the isolationist right, that is gunning for aid to Israel. Now, the good news is that they don't have the votes in the Congress. They don't. The overwhelming majority of the Congress, which is Constitution of the United States, the institution that holds the power of the purse and appropriates the money that we're talking about, is going to vote for, at least for the foreseeable future, a lot of money to be provided to Israel because we know it's in U.S. security interest to do this, and there is overwhelming support for Israel in the Congress. Now, that doesn't mean there's not going to be a lot of noise from some Senate Democrats like Chris Van Hollen calling for conditioning of aid, and the Squad and others. And obviously, if you have a president of the United States that moves the party or makes it okay to delegitimize Israel, to conduct political warfare against Israel, as the president has now done.
Look, I mean, I don't want to interrupt you, but it's definitely not in the margins when you have Chuck Schumer in the Senate calling for the overthrow of the democratically elected Israeli prime minister, and you have Nancy Pelosi signing on to a letter from the Squad essentially saying we should cut off military aid to Israel if they don't do, blah, 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 blah.
I don't disagree. No. So if the president of the United States is giving a green light for political warfare against Israel, he is going to empower his base. He's going to let this become more and more mainstream, which he has done. I fear Joe Biden has done potentially irrevocable harm to the Democratic Party's support for Israel in a way that not even Barack Obama did in some ways, even though obviously this really started under Obama's tenure with the fight over the Iran nuclear deal and other fights with the pro-Israel community in the United States. But this is where we stand. Is Chuck Schumer going to condition aid to Israel? No, I don't believe that. Was what he said way out of bounds? Yes, absolutely. Does he feel empowered to do that, or at least threatened by AOC and his left wing and Chris Van Hollen coming for his gavel as Senate leader? Yeah, I think that's a lot of reason of what's going on here. But you have the possibility of a president of the United States who would not support Israel in wartime. And you have the possibility that these crazy leftists take control of Congress, and one of them takes a leadership role and actually exerts their influence to stop, in the congressional appropriations process, a clean appropriations bill providing security assistance to Israel. That's possible. I don't know if it's going to happen next year, in 5 years, in 10 years. I hope it never happens. I think many of us are going to work against that for our entire lives to see that doesn't happen, but it could happen. The other pieces of this is non-political, and that is we have already seen the United States defense industrial base stretched thin. And so even if you have a supportive president and a supportive Congress, but you have the United States just churning out munitions on a nonstop basis for an ally in Ukraine, and then if China opens up a front in the Indo-Pacific and we're at war, or we're supporting Taiwan at war, in addition to Ukraine at war, and Israel's at war, we don't have the capacity in the United States to support that, let alone what Israel can do or can't do on its own. So for both of those reasons, Israel has to be hedging. Has to be. It's their strategic interest. It would be crazy for them not to have at least a parallel track of increased domestic manufacturing of the most critical munitions that it needs, those that either would be the most politicized in time of war, the way we're seeing today, or those that would be the least accessible from the United States, or at least available from the United States because of our own defense industrial base. So we're talking about everything from tank shells, artillery shells, ammunition you talked about, precision-guided munitions like JDAMs. These are all categories that Israel should become independent in. It doesn't mean you should stop buying from the United States these items. Brad Bowman and I at FDD, we just published recently a memo on this, putting out a lot of this information and these ideas.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that in a second, but I want to move to that in a second because I think the memo itself is very important. But I wanted to just specifically, right now we're in the situation, right? Right now on we're taping this on the 8th of April. We're in the situation where we're facing 6 fronts that are active in Judea and Samaria, from Jordan, from Iraq, from Syria, from Lebanon, and of course from Gaza and the Red Sea with the Houthis, and Iran itself. That may be more than 6. I kind of lost count while I was enumerating them. But we have a lot of stuff going on. And the United States is making it clear as a bell, that they do not support Israel in this war any longer. And Israel is and we've buckled under, or perceived to have buckled under Biden's very explicit, open, publicly, immediately leaked diktat to Netanyahu. And we Israelis have to live in this neighborhood. We can't turn our back on it. So what does Israel do now? You were talking about signaling. I don't know what signal means anymore. You're pulling out a division. That's not a signal. That's an action. So, I mean, it's not a question of signaling right now. It's a question of an action that, at a minimum, puts the enemy in a state of uncertainty. Because right now, the state of certainty that they have both dooms our hostages into Gaza and empowers them to take very aggressive action against Israel at their leisure.
Well, there's probably at least three things that need to happen. Number one, there needs to be a clear indication sent to the Iranians, and I would hope the United States would join with this, but clearly right now you can't get the United States to do much with Iran except send them $10 billion. There needs to be a threat of what will happen to Iran if they escalate in a way that is unprecedented. You can't go through the last 72, 96 hours, as we have with press reports, that Iran's going to launch a complex cruise missile and drone, maybe ballistic missile attack, not from Syria, not from Hezbollah, not from Iraq, from Iran at Israel, with Israelis freaking out about what's happening. We need to go to a bomb shelter. What's going on? Civil alerts going out about stockpiling and stuff. And there's no response right now from the Israelis of, this is what might happen if they do this. Why do the Iranians get to play this information operations game of scaring everybody with threats that still have not materialized? That should be something that the Israelis are intimidating the Iranians, not the other way around, because it's the Iranians that have started this war and waged this war for decades and have escalated it since October 7th, not the other way around. So that's number one. And by the way, why wait? Something else should go boom in Iran tomorrow. Something else should blow up in Syria or in Iraq or in Lebanon of a very high value. To say it's not just one and done, and now we're going to get under our desks like it's some sort of a nuclear drill, for those that are Cold Warriors. This is something that should be sustained, or Israel doesn't live in fear. There are other targets available. So that's one thing. There has to be a major message sent to the regime in Iran that their days could be numbered, that they will pay major prices, and they do not want to escalate. Number two, there has to be a clear signal being sent to Hezbollah that there will not be normalization of the status quo. Israel's walking itself, I fear, into this box of plan A versus plan B, and neither of them look to be something that can be achieved, at least today. Plan A is there's a massive full-scale war and total mobilization into southern Lebanon, ground campaign, push Hezbollah back to the Litani River. This is a massive undertaking. America is threatening military assistance, resupply of key munitions, for going after 4 more battalions of Hamas in Gaza. There is zero indication the United States is going to stick around to support any type of major escalation in southern Lebanon. In fact, there's plenty of evidence to the contrary, including leaked reports that the President of the United States already threatened U.S. support to this on October 8th, when this was contemplated inside the cabinet. So that's not happening. You still have this Amos Hochstein process playing out. Okay, so that's plan A, which doesn't seem to be anytime soon. Plan B is the Hochstein process. There's going to be this magical ceasefire, and Hezbollah is just going to agree to walk themselves 10 kilometers north. Probably not Litani, but 10 kilometers north, because that's the stated public guidance on what their anti-tank guided missiles can go, their distance, even though they have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of rockets and missiles that go much farther than that threaten way beyond northern Israel. drone swarm possibilities, all kinds of things that you're not accounting for. Even though the people, the fighters, live in the border communities in southern Lebanon where their families are, where their kids go to school, they're not walking themselves north. And Nasrallah likes the status quo. He's already proven that the Israelis either don't have the will or don't have the capability to actually have a major war that pushes back and degrades his capabilities. Therefore, why not sustain the status quo of squeezing Israel politically, domestically, where you have 100,000 citizens screaming at the top of their lungs, why aren't we allowed to go back to our homes? What are you doing about it? And you have nothing to do about it, except keep taking daily fire from Hezbollah and returning tit-for-tat escalations. So that's plan A and plan B. Both don't seem achievable.
But plan B is actually worse,
C.
right? Because, wait, let me just get to plan B a second, because it's actually worse than what you're putting out, because the deal that Hochstein is mediating is a deal that requires Israel to surrender its sovereign territory, including area called Mount Dov that controls all of northern Israel, to Hezbollah in exchange for this fake claim by Hezbollah that they're going to remove their forces 10 kilometers north. So it's not even a deal. It's a deal that's impossible for Israel to accept.
I would hope so. I would think so. If Nasrallah actually came to the table after there was a ceasefire in Gaza, if the United States forced that and Israel surrendered there truly, and then they went to Nasrallah and said, "You have victory. You have helped achieve the victory in Gaza," which is his propaganda. Now we can squeeze the Israelis more. They will make some concession on Mount Dov of some symbolic nature. The international community stands ready to pump tens of billions of dollars into Lebanon, which remains an economic and financial crisis. And this will be credit to Nasrallah for getting the international bailout. And they'll remove some buildings and move stuff north, and the fire will stop on northern Israel. And you'll have Israeli leaders come out and say, it's at least safe to go back north now. Just to save face, to get kids back in school by Rosh Hashanah of this year. Like, that's not an impossibility if Nasrallah wanted it to happen. I'm just not convinced that Nasrallah likes that idea, because he's still inflicting massive terror on northern Israel, not paying any price for it, putting Israel into knots domestically over the fact that they can't return people to the north, but are having the world normalize what is actually a state of war on a daily basis. So that's why, the Hochstein plan is terrible. Let me tell you, if it ever is accepted, it's horrible. I've written about this. But I'm not even sure that Nasrallah cares to entertain that, because he likes the status quo even more. So there has to be a plan C here of really being willing and capable of escalating in some way to force the North into some level of quiet and degrade Hezbollah's capabilities. If that's not achievable, that is a major security vulnerability and problem for Israel over the next several years. And the last piece, of course, is Gaza itself. All right, Gallant says, the defense minister says yesterday that Rafah is still going to happen. Not a lot of people believe that right now. Doesn't look that way. It's possible. I'm saying it's possible. I've talked to several high-level officials since this announcement was made of the withdrawal of Division 98, and everyone insists this was part of the pre-planned military strategy. Some of the humanitarian commitments that have been made in the last 96 hours, that is under duress from the United States. The military moves in Gaza announced on Sunday are not. And that it makes sense to pull these people out. They've been fighting hard for 4 months. They need a break. They need refitting. They will be used in Rafah. You want to get the troops out of the way to actually have populations moving out of Rafah. The population movement out of Rafah itself will take at least a month for evacuations to complete. Why would troops just sit there as sitting ducks? They can launch operations anytime. They have intel. They have special operations. They control Netzarim. They feel in very much control, and that they won't give at the bargaining table with in Egypt with Hamas what Hamas is asking for most, and that is the free flow of people across Netzarim back to the north.
No, that's an American demand. I mean, the United States has adopted all of Hamas's position and is demanding them as an American position.
Are pushing on it. And by the way, if Israel caves on that, it's game over. It's game over.
Right.
You can allow people to go through some sort of screening on a limited basis, on a controlled basis, if that helps also evacuate civilian populations from Rafah to enable a military operation. But if you allow unrestricted flows, no screening, then Hamas obviously embeds in the flow and takes back over any territory lost in the north, and then completes whatever command and control they still have in the south with the north, and then it's like you never even fought a war at this point. So
I read your article, your policy paper that you wrote about how to ensure that Israel has the weapons it needs with Brad Bowman a couple of weeks ago, and I look at it now and I see, the United States, from an Israeli perspective, I've been saying this for many, many years, that we have to end the military support that we receive from the United States. We can buy them like normal people, but we can't be in this client relationship with the United States anymore, because it's, as we see now here, our dependence on the United States is literally threatening our existence. We face these, one of the things that we hadn't really recognized, even I hadn't recognized it fully until October 7th, is that these Iranian proxies are also existential threats to Israel. We had been so focused on Iran's nuclear program that we had, even when we're thinking about the conventional threats at our doorstep, had not looked at it with the same leeriness, with the same concern. But then we saw on October 7th and subsequently that it actually is a nuclear level concern. And when we see the Palestinian Authority security services in Judea and Samaria and the heavy weapons that they've received over the years from the United States, the commando training that they've received from the United States, they are a full-fledged Western armed, heavily armed military organization that is absolutely indistinguishable from Hamas in terms of its genocidal intent in relation to the Jews of the land of Israel. So we're facing all of this, and the United States is siding with them against Israel. So we'd have to figure out very quickly, how are we going to be able to exist in this extremely hostile environment with the United States in an antagonistic position vis-a-vis Israel? And it's, I read what you wrote, but I felt like it was being more hopeful than realistic when you look at the full implications of what's happening now with the Biden administration. So I guess my first question to you is, why do you think, I'm trying to put it lightly because I'm feeling very heavy. What is it that is there something that makes you think that there's a problem with my analysis when I say that effectively we're fighting a two-front war right now against Iran and its terror proxies, and against an antagonistic American administration that's using its extraordinary leverage over Israel in order to force us into total capitulation?
So the threat analysis I largely agree with. The problems that are now compounded by the Biden administration's all-out political warfare and near threat of cutoff of military assistance last week, giving a green light to far-left people in the Congress to make this more mainstream, put pressure on what had previously been perhaps more centrist Democrats to cave to the pressure of this far-left base. All of this is highly problematic. And obviously in the context of when we published the memo, we had not seen sort of the unrelenting political warfare that the Biden administration has unleashed, I'd say, in the last month or so, and certainly not threats on the military assistance side. I think it is important for people to know that after October 7th, in the key moments where Israel looked at its stockpile, its reserve stockpile that the United States keeps in Israel, wartime reserve stockpile there, which had been tapped for Ukraine and drawn down extraordinarily of all key munitions that Israel needed and sent to Ukraine. And Israel realized it had already made a historic mistake of stopping to domestically produce a number of critical, just low-tech stuff that you need in a ground war, especially a multi-front ground war, and a sustained multi-front ground war at that, like tank shells. The United States stepped in a massive way, and Joe Biden did deliver an insane amount of munitions And on an ongoing basis, they had so much stuff coming in, the Israelis couldn't even keep up with what was being brought in at certain points. That is true for the, let's call it Q4 of 2023. And deliveries continued into 2024, and approvals continue to be made of the most critical types of munitions Israel needs to fight a war and potentially even fight a war in Lebanon, not just in Gaza. And agreements on larger platforms. Now, that is not to say that all of what we've seen in the news and what is happening right now is not a major threat and a red flag that Israel cannot be dependent on the United States for its most critical munitions for a time of war like this. Major mistake to shut down domestic production in those key areas and not to actually ramp up those key areas to be not just less dependent, but potentially independent in some of these key munitions. And it needs to happen. It should happen. I think most people that I've talked to have learned from it, and there's go signals in industry to try to make it happen. It needs to happen quicker. There is, however, also a reality that Israel does not have an unlimited defense budget. And I think if we just had a magic wand and said Israel can spend any amount of money at once on any platform in the world and everybody's going to sell it to them, and they can source components from anywhere at any time, and they can source raw materials like explosives at any point at any time, those things, that sounds wonderful, but that's not the case. Because you don't just buy a platform from one country, you also get different components to go into that platform from other countries. We're seeing that play out as Great Britain is threatening component sales. Canada has shut down component sales. These are big problems for the Israelis in some of the platforms, and the United States needs to be doing more to go after our allies to say, hey, you can't mess around with our platforms by holding up components. It's a whole separate conversation.
But they're the ones spurring the Canadians and the Dutch and the British to threaten Israel. I mean, the Americans are actually the ones propelling this action by Western governments to boycott Israel.
I'm not so sure on that level if the United States has ever gone to Canada and said...
It's certainly the case with the Germans that announced a sale of 155 millimeter tank shells to Israel, and then Biden immediately got on the phone with the chancellor, and it started getting slowed down.
Well, that's highly problematic. The British piece, I would say, the Sunak government is under a massive amount of pressure to cut off its arms sales. It has not done so, even though there are even some anti-Semitic Tories who we've known about for years that are not just the Lib Dems and Labour doing this. And they have resisted this. Boris Johnson came out and said we would oppose this. And I do think in general the UK likes to align with US policy and that there is not going to be any UK action if there's no US action. But bring it back to the point I was making, and that is the United States cannot be your sole point of failure, your single point of failure in certain areas like this. But you also have to know that you can't actually make everything yourself. You can't afford everything yourself. Look at what's also going to go into the new defense budget for Israel in this new round that they're contemplating. You're going to extend the number of days of reserves, so that's more expensive. You're going to have healthcare costs and veterans benefits and combat benefits and all kinds of stuff for the people who are coming out of the war in Gaza. You're going to be increasing domestic production and all these munitions that we've recommended and talked about. And you're still going to be looking to do more. And it's like, where is all the money going to come from in a limited budget? These are real questions. That said, what has also just happened? Amidst political warfare by the Biden administration against Israel, amidst all the protests and all the letters and all the calls for conditioning of aid and all the worry, the Congress did approve its fiscal year 24 bill with a lot of stuff in it. The money for Israel within the Memorandum of Understanding, billions of dollars, the money for co-development of missile defense, prohibition on funding UNRWA until next March. A lot of stuff got in there, and it passed the Congress. It got signed by the President of the United States. And so so what is that $3.3 billion good for? That should not be money that's taken out to buy tank shells or to buy artillery shells or to build bullets for rifles. That is stuff Israel should be doing and ramping up. But Israel cannot afford to do all those things it's not doing today, which it needs to, and buy F-35s, and buy F-15s, and buy Apache helicopters.
So we were actually discussing that as well in Israel. There was the military made an agreement, and Defense Minister Gallup made an agreement when he was in Washington, I think a week and a half ago, with Lloyd Austin, that we were going to buy another squadron of F-35s and F-15s. And there's a lot of pushback in Israel about that plan, that we cannot make a determination about the future buildup of the IDF without any public input into the process, because we're facing air forces that are based on unmanned aircraft, drones, and of course missiles, and they're much less expensive and very effective. And with the precision-guided systems, it's not at all clear that manned flight should be Israel's plan for developing its forces up to and including, past 2040. And that's really what these two squadrons are about. And so there's a real question whether that money, the 35 billion shekels, is something that we want to spend on U.S. aircraft, even if some of it or most of it is being subsidized by U.S. military assistance. So it's not at all clear that the Air Force-centric structure of Israel's forces is the correct structure going forward after what we've seen in Gaza and the expansion of conventional land forces being really the order of the day. So I think, that's a question where we would use the aid or how we would use the aid going forward that is open. And the idea that the same generals who screwed everything up so completely and absolutely and totally misread the intentions of our enemies, that they should be the ones determining how to build the military going forward. I think that's pretty clearly not what should be happening. So we'll have to see how that goes with the aircraft.
I think those are very strong and valid points, and those are ultimately what Israel has to decide what is best for their security and long-term procurement for whatever the new strategic paradigm is.
But what should the $3.8 billion be used for? Obviously not for basic goods, which is what we've been doing because of the Obama MOU that required Israel to spend, most of the money in the United States. We were actually going to American contractors for things that we had been producing domestically, because why pay for it if we can get it in the United States? So I think that that's something that has to change, and then it becomes a question of what is Israel's interest to buy in the United States with those coupons.
I think that's exactly right. I think you go through what are your strategic priorities, what do you actually need for all of your components, service components, long term, next 1 year, 5 year, 10 years. What are the different prices of the things you need to procure, whether it's platforms, systems, munitions, whatever it is, and then say, okay, we have identified that we actually need, this many new Apache squadrons or this many F-15 still to be updated with the next revision, in 10 years. And this, because things are a long time procurement, unfortunately for the United States, problem that we have, which compounds Israel's problems. So these things do have to be taken into account. And if you do need something that costs $5 billion, $6 billion, and you have the appropriations from the Congress still available, and you can lock it in, you should lock it in. Yet, by the way, if there's a massive amount of munitions that are ready to ship, and you can buy them while you're still building the factories to make sure you don't have to ever buy them in the future, that you're building them, you should stockpile as much munitions as possible for what's coming in Lebanon.
One of the problems, though, Richard, is that we determined that we needed another squadron of Apaches, and the Americans said no. We wanted the F-15Is, and they said no, and they keep pushing us to buy more and more F-35s, which are, at least they're improved over what they used to be, but that's not an all-in-one fighter plane for Israel. And so the problem is that on the one hand, we have this military assistance, but the Americans are demanding or dictating what we have to buy with it. So these things are not even necessarily things that Israel wants, and it's not necessarily the best use of the resources. So if the Americans are pushing us to take systems that then require that we spend a lot of money on the ground in maintenance and training crews and having crews to handle them, it might just be better to forego that assistance and just concentrate on the things that we actually need to build. Because I think one of the things that has taken preference over Israel's actual needs are the preferences of American military manufacturers, because they're demanding that we buy these F-35s, and so we do. And then we pretend that that's what we need, as opposed to starting with what we need and seeing how we achieve those goals.
I can't speak to specifics as far as the negotiations going on of that nature, but when I was in government and have been in government, both in the executive branch and in the Congress, with a lot of oversight on our foreign military financing, this is an iterative process. There are various venues. If something like that was happening, if the Israelis are being forced into buying something that they don't want to buy with the money that Congress is appropriating for Israel's security, then Congress would want to know about that, and Congress will want to have a say in that. And there are prerogatives for Congress to step in if something like that takes place. Obviously, if the Israelis never admit that and never talk to somebody in Congress, then nobody would know or be able to prove it. But this is not to say that, again, if you have the ability to have $3 billion or more per year appropriated by the Congress, because people do want to support Israel because they know it's in our best interest for Israel to be strong, not just to buy American things. It's helpful. It's good. As an American, I like that. But it's not the primary objective here to increase the security of our allies, to increase their self-reliance and their ability to take security measures in the region, which reduce pressure on the United States. There is still a bottom line that Israel's going to have to meet. Like, okay, you're not going to buy an F-15, you're not going to buy an Apache because we won't let you, apparently. You don't want the F-35. Okay, what do you need? What does the Air Force actually need, and how are you going to get what the Air Force needs? What does the Army actually need? What does the Navy actually need? And that's got to be, I agree with you, your bottom line point is, what do you need, and how do you go about getting it? It needs to be the guiding force here.
So I want to just ask you one final question, because, what can I do? I have to admit I'm pretty upset about what's going on the ground, and the treatment that Israel's received from the Biden administration and continues to receive. But, going forward, how, as an American looking at what the administration is doing, how do you think that this is going to impact American national security today, tomorrow, and in the years to come? Also, when you see the domestic threat here with people who support jihad openly marching on the street and calling for genocide, and we saw clips from Dearborn, Michigan yesterday, I think it was, calling for death to America, and these are U.S. citizens. So, I mean, when you see what the Biden administration's posture is, what do you think the implications are for U.S. national security, both at home and in terms of the United States' position as a global superpower going forward?
Oh, I think the Biden administration, the President of the United States, has made historic mistakes, continues to make mistake after mistake in the message he sends, not just to our enemies, but to our allies. And just because some highbrowed anti-Semitic European may approve of what the president is doing with respect to conducting political warfare against Israel, I don't think this sits well in Taipei. I don't think this ultimately sits well in Kyiv. I don't think this sits well in capitals like Warsaw, where people know that ultimately, whether they do things in public, whether they say things in public, oh, by the way, Arab Gulf capitals that condemn Israel at the top of their lungs right now through their foreign ministries, public statements, and in private are praying to God every day that Israel completes the job and destroys Hamas, and that America supports them in that mission quietly. Those allies see America as no longer reliable. They already believe that. They already saw it happening. And so what are we doing right now? We're pulling the rug out of Ukraine because one side of America has fallen under the false impression that we should hand Eastern Europe to Vladimir Putin. The other side of America now wants to destroy Israel and pull the rug out of that ally and hand the Middle East to Iran and its terror proxies, empower Islamic radicalism. So we are in a very precarious situation right now as the United States, as a superpower, signaling to our key enemies, our key adversaries in China, Russia, Iran, other actors like North Korea and Venezuela. It's open season, totally open season on a U.S. ally. It's open season on a democracy, and it's open season on the United States, because what are we going to do even when we get attacked? When 3 Americans are killed in Jordan, what are we going to respond with? Nothing against the primary sponsor of that attack. In fact, we're going to offer them more money. So we are in a very backward situation right now for our national security. And I don't know what political benefit the president thinks he's getting out of this policy catastrophe, but I don't think that's even being achieved by their own metrics. He would have been much better off on policy and politics, standing by a U.S. ally and calling attention to the craziest things that happen every day from those that support Hamas. You talk about Dearborn, Michigan. I mean, the President of the United States would score huge points with suburban voters in all the areas where he's running if he were to go and point out how Islamic radicals are dangerous to our country, how people who say these things are outside the mainstream, are fringe, are violent extremists, that Israel and the people of Israel are people who support America, who have the same values of the United States of America. The people who they are fighting in Hamas do not, and show every day what Hamas does and who they are, and talk about the opinion polls of the average person on the street supporting October 7th and wanting to see more Jews die. There's no internalization that there is a moral right and a strategic correctness in supporting Israel. There is instead, and I'll leave with this, a very tragic political decision by the president to believe he can triangulate between good and evil, that he can triangulate between Israel and Hamas/Iran. And what he has done is actually appease no one and driven himself into a larger political hole, and more importantly for me, a very big national security hole.
Okay, well, I think we're just going to leave it at that. We're in difficult times. It's always important to talk to people who have a very clear understanding of the situation to try to understand it. So I really appreciate you coming on the show and all the work that you do at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy and more broadly. So thank you very much, and happy Passover to you and your family. Thank you very much.
You too, and to everyone.